is Helen Siu. I'm with the Hong Kong Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences. Thank you for coming at this in this kind of weather. But we always say that dignitaries, when they travel, they bring stormy weather. So thank you for coming. So, Vice Chancellor, colleagues, students, friends, this is my great honor to introduce our distinguished speaker, Mr. Amitav Ghosh. I know I stand between you and some exciting conversations that we anticipate, so I'm going to be brief. So one sentence, that Mr. Ghosh needs no introduction. So, but let me say a few words about why the Institute and our organizers are putting this together. So the Hong Kong Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences is very eager to host this event together with the Indian Consulate and also with the New York University, Shanghai. The Institute has pursued an inter-Asia research agenda since 2006. You know, I can brag that at least a whole decade before China ever started this one belt, one road idea. So we're a little ahead. So, but my interest in Mr. Ghosh's work started years earlier when I assigned one of his books for a class at Yale. In an antique land, that's the one I used. In an antique land focuses on the author's effort as an anthropology student traveling in Egypt to uncover the networked world of a medieval Jewish trader from Tunisia who ended up living in Mangalore. So the book, as described by the publisher at the time in 1992, is like this. It's a subversive history in the guise of a traveler's tale, bursting with exuberant details on the private lives of very ordinary people, from the Crusades all the way to Operation Desert Storm. And these lives, I would say, would otherwise have left very barely discernible traces in history books. But Mr. Ghosh's work make them very much alive. I feel very connected to Mr. Ghosh, not only, I would say, because of our shared interest in anthropology and storytelling. Moreover, as a South China scholar working on the maritime, I have been very struck by how my research sites were historically well connected with places in Southeast Asia, in South Asia, in the Indian Ocean, in the Gulf, and then also in north and eastern coast of Africa. And in subsequent conversations with Mr. Ghosh, I realized that he has been looking east and west along similar routes that crisscrossed the region for many centuries. And the human footprints left distinguishing marks on local communities as well as in mindsets. And that's something that I really feel very, very close intellectually to all the work that Mr. Ghosh has been writing. When we met at Yale a few years ago, I promised to take Mr. Ghosh to the temple for the god of the South Seas, Nanhai Shen Miao, Langhoi Shen Liu, and that's in Guangzhou. And there you found a South Asian-looking sojourner, now in a very elaborate Chinese literati robe, being worshipped for centuries by little ladies in the area in Guangzhou. And these are the faithful for a very long time, and this is obviously a foreigner. I would also like to take him to a mosque here, the Jamia Mosque here in Hong Kong, It's a hidden landmark, if you haven't discovered that. It's a hidden landmark near the mid-levels escalator. Originally, it's named Lasker Temple. Lasker is, you know, very prominent in Mr. Ghosh's trilogy. The temple was built in 1890 with extensions funded by a migrant from Bombay in 1915. In Seungwan, you know, the western district here, near the Manmo Temple and also the Donghua Hospital, set up in 1872 by Chinese merchants. There, you would find a street right near there called Lasker Road. Moral guide. At the end of the street is a century-old store supplying authentic spices for Chinese and Indian kitchens. I still get my curry powder there, and I can assure you the Chinese manager there has wonderful recipes. Anyway, so it's not difficult to appreciate Hong Kong, Canton, Macau, Bombay, Calcutta as hubs in an Asian region that was multicultural, multi-ethnic, vibrant in its economic energies, and also volatile in its political fortunes. So Mr. Ghosh's work always displayed a rare combination of deep anthropological sensitivities and also superb archival smoothing and, of course, very beautiful literary imagination. In the trilogy, I hope he's going to talk about focusing on Canton and Indian Ocean and India, he uncovers the forces of culture, of market, of politics sweeping across a very broad Asian region, and in the age of empire. It's basically 19th century for the trilogy. These happenings were the unintentional results of individual passions, family intrigues, business strategies, and also crisis of faith and national pride. So portraying these people making themselves as they make history, I think Mr. Ghosh has given ordinary folks the humanity they deserve. So I suspect that today his talk focusing on Canton's India connections will highlight these themes. We look forward to a very inspiring afternoon of conversations. So, I'm pleading for Mr. Ghosh to talk as long as he wants, because I think most of us here really would like to hear him. But at the same time, we would definitely also invite our three panelists here to join in to make their brief comments. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Ghosh.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming out on this rainy day. And thank you, Helen, for that very generous and wonderful introduction. I must say, I feel somewhat intimidated to be here in the company of scholars who know so much more about the subject than I do. Because they've approached it from the sort of a citadel of scholarship, as it were, having mastered the materials and the languages that are necessary to approach a subject that is as complex, really, as 19th century, as the 19th century oceanic world, which is in the first place, an incredibly multilingual space, and that is perhaps the most intimidating aspect of it. I entered this realm from a completely different perspective and through a completely different route, as it were. As a novelist, I really follow characters. That's what leads me forward into a story. And when I started writing the Ibis trilogy, what I had in mind really was that I was going to be writing about Indian departures, the ways in which Indians left the Indian subcontinent in the 19th century. And it's something that we forget that, India and China today, with these huge diasporas around the world, we tend to think of them as, these diasporas as some of the most important, and of course they are among the most important. But India and China were not historically diasporic civilizations. So unlike, for example, Europe or the Arab world, or the Malay world, Arabs from very early on scattered around the world. They traveled, Yemenis especially, into so many parts of the world. Europeans, of course, they were the first and one of the first diasporas really, and remain so. But for India and China, this business of settling in large numbers overseas, of leaving their countries, and in mass migrations and settling in other continents, that's something that really starts in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And in the case of India, it was really through indentured migration. So that was the story that really drew me into the Ibis trilogy. I was interested in exploring the ways in which indentured workers left India in the 19th century, and that has a connection with my own life history, because my own family left Bengal, which is where I'm from. It left our ancestral sort of area in what is now Bangladesh in the 1850s, and the family story is that what happened was that the river, which was next to our ancestral village, it was a river called the Podda, a very vast river, that one day during some sort of cataclysmic weather event, it changed course and it drowned our ancestral village. This is something that happens quite a lot in Bengal, because it's a deltaic landscape, it's very changeable. So my ancestors were set adrift, and they started to move westwards, and they settled in Bihar, and they settled near Patna. Now the curious thing about the Indian indenture is that the great majority of the indentured workers who left India in the 19th century were from the interior of India. They were actually from Bihar, from the region that my ancestors settled in. Now this is, we all Indians take it for granted that this is what happened, because we know that, Bhojpuri, the language of this region, is today spoken in Mauritius, in Fiji, in Guyana, and so on. But, as I sort of got into this story, suddenly this phenomenon struck me as something very odd. Because usually when people leave a country and travel abroad, those people are almost always from coastal regions. So in China, from Guangdong, from Fujian, and so on. In Europe, it's usually the Basque country, it's Devon, Cornwall, etc. That is lands that really border on the sea, coastal areas. Similarly, in the Arab world, it's Yemen. But it struck me as very strange that suddenly you have this phenomenon of people who live 600 or 700 miles from the sea, that is in this region of this Bhojpur region. Suddenly we see, hundreds of thousands of them, and then millions, getting up and abandoning their ancestral lands. And this is the most settled part of India. It's the heartland of India. These people are living, they have no familiarity with the sea. They actually have a great fear of the sea. They call the sea the Kala Pani, the black water. So I began to wonder, what is it that has set this great movement in motion? What is it in the background? And there are many things, of course, that were happening in the sort of early colonial period, late 18th, early 19th centuries, famines as well, and the closure of the labor markets and so on. But then I discovered also that this is exactly the area in which the British, in the late 18th century, had decided to expand opium production. And opium was not produced under a plantation model. It was produced on family farms as a winter crop But what they would do is that opium, the whole production of opium was an East India Company monopoly, and farmers could only sell their opium to the East India Company. What the East India Company would do is that it would foist loans on these farmers. So it would tie them into a kind of debt slavery. I mean, there are stories of them throwing loans into farmers' windows so that they were caught in this cycle. And it was terrible for the farmers because they were producing opium essentially below cost, which continued through the 19th century. So the huge profits that came from opium production actually went entirely to the East India Company. So whatever the case may be, it's not enough research has been done on this subject, and actually that is one of the most curious things about this whole thing. That even though vast quantities of material exist, in fact, there's so much material on opium that actually any part of the East India Company collections that you try to consult in the library, in the British Library, almost every page there's something about opium, either revenue or growing or trade or export. But just to put it all together would be a Herculean task. And I'm glad to say that my book has evidently inspired some people to start working on this. But actually, I have friends, historians in India, who've written about sugarcane, cotton, etc. Yet opium, which was really the foundation of the colonial economy in so many ways, has been so under-researched. It's a really mysterious thing. I mean, there's John Richards' work, which is on opium in Eastern India. There's Amar Farooqi's work, which is on opium in Western India. But there's really nothing which is a kind of overview of opium production in general in India. So we don't really even know what the impacts of the opium trade were on the peasantry, on the countryside. But it's certainly my feeling that growing this cash crop in the late 18th, early 19th century, in essentially what it was a peasant subsistence economy, must have created some sort of agricultural, some sort of dislocation, which sent a lot of people, which caused a lot of people to leave the land and go abroad. So it was through this route that I came upon this whole story of opium, and after that it was really a question of following those leads eastwards into China. And as I said, my interest in these subjects really grows from people, from the characters that one picks up. So, one of the major characters in the book is a Parsi opium trader who comes from Bombay to Canton. Another major character is a soldier in the East India Company's army who come to China. So for me, it was really the effort really lay in trying to recreate, as it were, the experience of these characters, what that experience would have been in 19th century China. And it's a field that's very difficult to explore, of course, because there's such limited material. And as always, whenever one deals with India, with Indian history, there's always this kind of desperate lack of any kind of Indian voice, of any kind of Indian record. It's just so completely absent. I mean, for example, but it's not just India in this instance. I mean, if you consider that in the 19th century, millions of Indians and Chinese went into the indentured labor. They left India and China as coolies. As far as I've been able to find, there's not a single Chinese account of the experience of indenture. There's not a single Indian account of the experience of indenture in the 19th century. And it's not because these were uneducated people. A lot of the people who went into the indenture were actually Rajputs and Brahmins from educated castes. I'm sure a lot of the Chinese who went into indenture were also educated because there was a very widespread literacy in China. And the true weirdness of this becomes evident when you realize that Indian and Chinese indentured labor was essentially meant to substitute for slave labor. But by the late 18th century, African slaves and their descendants were producing many accounts of slavery. We have many recorded accounts of the slave experience, written or dictated by African slaves. But nothing similar exists for Indians and Chinese. So it's one of those huge sorts of gaps, in the history. And I don't know how one accounts for it. But an even stranger gap, really, is that of Indian soldiers. So, from the 1760s onwards, hundreds of thousands of Indians fought in the East India Company's armies. Literally, by the First World War, it was millions of soldiers. Tens of millions of Indians had served in the East India Companies and the British colonial armies. And for this entire period, from 1760 to 1900, would you like to guess how many first-hand accounts we had written by Indian soldiers? British soldiers, we have literally thousands. But by an Indian, one. But even that is apocryphal. So you're right. Actually, there are no reliable sources as such. But there's one account left behind, said to have been dictated by an Indian soldier to an English officer. And it was so we only possess actually the English version of it, although that has been translated back into a Hindi dialect called Awadhi. So, so when you try to think of reconstructing what the experiences of these soldiers was like in 19th century China, it's so difficult. It's so hard to recreate any aspect of that experience. One thing we do know, and which is certainly borne out by my own experience as a reporter traveling around the world in areas where Indian soldiers have been involved in fighting and so on, is that Indian soldiers in general are very clued in. They are very, very aware of things that are happening around them. They're very politically sharp. So, say for example, with this one apocryphal account that we do have, it's called Sitaram Subedar. This guy, he goes to, this soldier fights in Afghanistan at about the same time as the Opium War, that is 1839-1840. He is incredibly sharp in his descriptions of the political circumstances in Afghanistan. I doubt very much that any British officer had that degree of insight into what was happening in Afghanistan. So we can be sure that the Indian soldiers who did come here understood that they were very attentive, that they were seeing what was happening around them, they were registering this, they were thinking about it. What they made of it, we don't know. But we do know that later, another Indian soldier who came to fight to put down the Boxer Rebellion, he left behind an autobiography. And there again, we see that he was paying careful attention to Chinese politics, Chinese developments, and more than that, he was extremely sympathetic towards China. He was very sympathetic to what was happening to the Chinese. He understood why they were trying to resist, what had happened in India, happening here. So it's from clues like that that you have to try and piece together, what their experiences were. But even there are so many aspects of it that are just closed doors. For example, we know now that religion was a very important aspect of a soldier's life in the 19th century. Actually, sadhus and so on, sadhus are mendicants, religious mendicants. They actually formed a large part of 19th century Indian armies. But there were all sorts of religious experiences involved in the lives of these soldiers. So what was their battlefield experience like? And it's very hard to know. It's almost impossible to know. What was the battlefield experience of a Chinese soldier like? Now, if you think of, say, the First World War, many of you will have heard of the Angel of Mons. This was, when the German army was breaking through in Belgium, many soldiers claimed to have seen this angel appear above the trenches, bearing a flaming sword. And it became one of the most powerful legends of the First World War. So these things have, in 19th century armies, you can be sure that, the battlefield experience was profoundly imbued with visions, with all sorts of revelations and so on, which actually probably led to some of the quasi-religious uprisings that subsequently happened in China. So all of those things are really closed books to us. We can't even begin to approximate, those experiences. So one is necessarily, as it were, writing in the dark a lot of the time. And really, for me, there's so many aspects of this world that I would like to know more about, and I've been looking forward to this dialogue simply because there are so many aspects of this world. I want to hear from John, for example, about what was the nature of the company in the 19th century. We in the East have grown used after 100 years of being beaten on the head and being told that everything interesting about financial life was invented in the West. And this is so completely untrue once you begin to look into this world. For example, if you go to Wikipedia and Google commodity futures markets, it will tell you that the commodity futures markets were invented in Chicago in the 1850s. But actually, commodity futures markets existed in India for 500 years, and certainly the commodity futures markets in opium were very active in the 18th century in India. So many aspects of what we call company history, for example, I think are actually borrowed from Chinese practices and Indian practices. Certainly, it's perfectly clear to me that the Parsi enterprises that started up, to some substantial degree, modeled themselves on Chinese family firms, and they continue to do that to this day. I was just talking to John about adoptions, and that continues to be a practice in the Tata family, for example, until quite recently. So, there's so much to be learned from this. I'm really looking forward to hearing from Angela about the medical exchanges. So there are so many sorts of different exchanges here. Townsend knows he's an encyclopedia of knowledge on older Indo-Chinese exchanges in this region. So without any further ado, I want to pass this on to them.
So I think what we should do now is to give our three panelists the opportunity to say a few words about their particular engagement with Amitav's work. Is that okay? So which one would you like to start with? So finance, company.
It was a great honor for me to be here today. You don't know how much I'm in awe of the people here. I think some of you know I just published a book on more or less the same topic, and not that I'm obsessed or anything. I've been checking Amazon for the bestsellers rank, and mine is 1.8 million now. Because someone else bought one book. And, well, so I'm in the presence of someone who writes book articles who would be bestsellers, lasting booksellers too. So I'm very privileged to be here. Now, why am I bringing it up? Well, jokes aside, I'm not trying to highlight just the commercial viability or the lack thereof of academic publishing versus creative writing, but also to think about the exchange between those two. I actually borrow heavily from works outside of the archives as well, and I think that as historians, we tend to be a little bit ossified in the way we do things. Well, after all, the word history and story share the same roots, and the last I checked with my dictionary, it just means narrative by learned people, and I think we all qualify. Well, mine less so, and we are all doing history of some sort. And the separation of history versus story, and history as a profession versus creative writing, is more of a recent invention, recentness in the last few centuries. And the same thing actually is true, actually more so, in this part of the world. Well, our word for history is like 历史 or 历史, right? And that to me doesn't quite, unless you want to mine our historical sources, is usually just see, right? And that somehow imposes a certain type of historical thinking, the way we construct our narratives. We do have words for stories, and the easiest one to come up with is 故事, right? 故事. And what does that mean? It's just events of the past. So what is a story if it's not history? So I have been trying to challenge myself to think about the dynamics between those two and to see how we can borrow from one another. I think historians are becoming more creative in using more creative accounts in retrieving what happened in the past But what I have not been as good at doing is to see how we can write a book that would actually engage people to reach a wider readership. And that's, I think, the primary difference between what I do and what our guest, our key speaker here does. I think what we can see in the trilogy too, and you don't need to look any further than to look at the acknowledgements. He is actually more learned, and he has written a whole lot more when he writes his books compared to my enterprise writing mine. He has read books after books, he has been to archive after archive before he constructed the history. So it's no surprise that I find so much resonance in the characters he depicts, the events there, and actually this physical space that he describes. The world we're talking about is a very transnational world. Transnational world connected by people who are eager to do business, or who are actually, in more general terms, to make a living. We talked about the multilingual aspect of it. And I think to even call it multilingual might not give it as much credit, and I'll get to that in just a millisecond. Well, we talk about voices. And the many voices that you hear in the trilogy really appeal to me. To the juvenile inside of me, the many vulgar lines that he has in there in Cantonese, well, it's quite interesting. And of course, I have a blind spot with all the Indian voices because I just don't know those languages. We talked about the city there of scholarship. I think that's how you said it, right? It sounds lofty, but actually I find it very constricting. I'll explain. Well, when I was reading the book, I was just thinking, I forgot to tell them, you cannot have Cantonese romanization next to all this pinyin in there. That's just confusing, and you're not supposed to do that in a book. But I caught myself. Why? Well, I was reading some American traders, their papers in Boston. And what did I find? Well, this poor guy is trying to learn Chinese from some erudite scholar. He was learning in Mandarin. Well, it is not Mandarin, as you know. It is language of the officials. So then he tried to apply that in the Cantonese marketplace. So he was speaking his Gunhua to a whole bunch of hawkers, and those people looking like, what the heck I do? So as I was reading the book and I was reflecting on how we actually use our languages, I find the trilogy more of an accurate depiction of how things happened, what happened in that particular period. And of course, you don't have great places like Hong Kong U, NYU, Yale, teaching you all these languages, right? So how do people communicate? Well, pidgin English, right? That's what we call it. What is pidgin? As you pointed out to us, pidgin is business. And for us Cantonese speakers, it's not difficult to understand why pidgin is business, because for a Cantonese speaker who doesn't have any Western language exposure to say business, this is a tough word with all the consonants and vowels in the middle of that. So the corrupt form of that, or at least the way they said it, was pidgin. Is it sufficient to call it pidgin English? I actually did wonder after reading the trilogy. Why do you not call it pidgin Chinese? Why do you not call it pidgin whatever? I mean, I think to pigeonhole it into a particular language is already quite a problem for us. We talked about the subversive aspects of the trilogy, and I think that's also a great invitation, as I was reading the trilogy, to suspend our moral judgment. Well, people in the past didn't calibrate their moral compass the same way we have our moral compasses. And to say that we're to suspend judgment doesn't mean that we need to be more forgiving, more generous in our assessment of their morality, but to be more reflective of what we do. One passage I love in there is actually from River, page 428. That's a toast there to free trade, universal trade, the extinction of all monopolies, and especially the odious one, the palm monopoly. Well, one can easily substitute other words in there for free trade. How about free market? Democracy. How much better are we now as we are substituting our own universal values to our present situation than they were back in those days? There's this issue of political configurations and our preconceived notion of how it should work. We're talking about how things might have changed over the last 2 centuries. Well, we have our honorable counsel from Singapore here. I think the way we think about it is that you go seek protection from your own country when things go wrong. But then we don't need to look far. In there, in the trilogy, we have a passage of a Western trader who told us that before the Opium War, there was no part of the world where foreigners felt his life and property more secure than in Canton. True, it resonates with me. I see more of the Chinese merchants being sent on exile than Westerners getting into trouble in Canton at that time. So I think our judgment has been somewhat clouded by what happened after that, and we need to situate ourselves in that particular moment to understand the reality of the situation. Political confusion is one. He asked me about companies. That's yet another interesting aspect. We just started talking about it before it's time for us to get started here. Jardine Matheson, well-established British firm here in Hong Kong. We expect it to be the epitome of corporate structure, no? Well, in my records, in the records I examined in the 1850s, there was a dispute because they rented a house from the Chinese merchant I studied, Hokwa, and it was signed by a certain Matheson. So they were in arrears in rent, and they were taken to court in no other place but Hong Kong. And what happened then? Well, Jardine Matheson decided, well, our line of defense is that you sign a certain document with a certain Matheson, and Jardine Matheson, the company, should not be held responsible for the rent. So the idea of the individual, the partnership, the corporation, that was certainly a lot more fluid then than it is now. I do love the crafting of personalities in the trilogy. We're talking about people. And I think as we explore the various personalities in there, we see that those people are more transnational than what we consider ourselves, the global citizens of our time. One of the Western traders actually said when he was about to face the prospect of a permanent exile from Canton that he realized as never before that this place had been an essential part of his life, not just for reasons of business. It is here in Canton that he has always felt most alive. Is here that he learned to live. So we are talking about transnational business. We're talking about transnational exchange. That's somewhat predicated on the nation, which is more of our imposition on ourselves than people at that time. I think we need to recognize the fluidity, the dynamics of that period, and I hope that this panel is but the beginning of great collaborations among people from different disciplines, different backgrounds, to understand a past that was not perfect, but it's also a past in which many enterprising individuals actually improvise in various ways to engage one another in mutual exchange. Thank you.
I mean, for somebody who switched to being to pursue academics after quite a few years of being in the finance profession, I hope you haven't decided that you've made the wrong choice. I can tell. So maybe, Angela, would you like to start? To be the next one? Angela is the director for the Hong Kong Institute for the Humanities and Social Science, trained in Paris, and a medical historian. So she's going to talk to us about battlefield experience in a medical sense. Stay tuned.
I totally agree with Mr. Ghosh that it's important to find out how ordinary people in the past lived, soldiers, farmers, workers. And we humble historians try to do that from different angles. And I look at those, I try to do that through the way people live their bodies, with diseases, with injuries, and so on. Of course, I don't do that as well as Mr. Ghosh does with his novels. But I think reading his the last of his trilogy, Butterflies, I find a lot of inspiration and a lot of admiration on how he deals with the problem of people treating the injuries and violence and so on. So I will focus on his last book and on the problem of medicine. The myriad global connections among people and things of different cultures and historical backgrounds wonderfully set on stage by Mr. Ghosh, continue to captivate readers in Flood of Fire, the last of the trilogy. I'm particularly impressed by the atmosphere of general physical and moral brutality reigning in Canton before and after the Opium War, and the way ordinary people survived this climate of daily violence. Even though Flood of Fire is not exactly a history book, it is much better than a history book, in fact. It very precisely illustrates the rich, complex, and multicultural medical traditions in the Canton region in the 19th century. My particular interest in medical matters made me follow more closely the trajectory of one of the four major characters of the story, Neil, the Bengali, working in Canton as a translator for the Chinese government. He had close association with local Cantonese and was involved in major battles of the Opium War. As through his eyes, I think we more or less witnessed the Opium War from the Chinese side. We don't have a major character in the book, but through him, I think we really had a good glimpse of the Opium War, of the Opium War. In the novel, Neil underwent two major medical interventions, both by Buddhist monks. In the famous Ocean Banner Monastery in Canton, in Henan, in Cantonese is Hoi Tong Zi, which exists in real life, of course. Mr. Ghosh, I'm sure he has done a lot of research on that temple. And one of the four major Buddhist monasteries in Canton, actually, and it's today a major tourist spot. Neil first fell seriously ill because of the hot and humid weather in Canton, and was treated by a lama, an acquaintance of a Tibetan monk that he befriended in that monastery. And under the pen of Mr. Ghosh, the lama prescribed all kinds of foul-smelling tonics and teas that effectively cured him. Neil was later hit by a bullet during a major battle in the Opium War on the Pearl River estuary, very graphically depicted towards the end of the novel. And this time he was again treated inside a monastery by a group of Chinese and Tibetan monks who extracted the bullets with, here I quote, fearsome-looking needles and instruments. And he was eventually cured by the group of monks, Chinese and Tibetan. So temples and monasteries were, of course, major sites of medical practice in late imperial China, including surgical art, which was not a mainstream practice in literati medicine. I don't know how well, how deeply Mr. Ghosh has, research on this topic, but the way you describe the person being treated in a monastery, I think was fantastic. And Mr. Ghosh's meticulous research and tremendous grasp of historical sources are major ingredients for the success of his novels. Although for the uninformed reader, medical skills of Chinese and Tibetan monks in Canton may look simply exotic. I would simply add another layer of history here to illustrate the extremely rich and complex medical culture in Canton in the 1840s, years of the Opium War. If Buddhist and Tibetan monks and their medical skills may look exotic to non-Chinese, like the Bengali Neil, Western surgical art equally marveled the local Cantonese population. Canton was a violent place in the 19th century. Foreign trade was unruly, and there was a lot of greed involved. That was very well depicted in your novel. And conflicts among local traders, attacks by bandits and pirates equipped with firearms were part of the city's daily life. If foreign visitors were willing to try the medical skills of colorful, mysterious Chinese and Tibetan monks, local Cantonese were also not shy to visit the Canton Hospital, directed by Yale-trained Dr. Peter Parker, set up in 1835, well before the Opium War then, with the help and support of some of the richest home merchants. I think John knows the story well. Here, a good number of Cantonese inhabitants of different social classes were treated for injuries by gunshots in the 1840s, especially on waterways where merchandise was transported. In 1844, according to the report of the hospital, there were at least 4 instances of that. A pregnant Tanka boat woman was hit in the chest by an iron ball accidentally shot on board a chop boat, which is a lighter for bringing goods to vessels. She did not survive the surgery, but the doctor saved the baby using the latest obstetrical instruments in the hospital. A second case was a Cantonese manufacturer of toys traveling on a boat attacked by pirates near Dongguan. He was hit by a bullet in the right thigh at about the same time. The American doctor applied leeches and poultices to the swollen limb, though the patient did not return as instructed. 2 other young men in the same year were shot during a crossfire between 2 boats, and then they had the bullets extracted by long and difficult surgeries in the hospital. These examples continued well into the latter part of the 19th century. In 1864, for instance, at least 3 men hit by bullets were successfully treated in the hospital. Bullets were extracted by surgery, 1 in the leg, 1 in the knee, and 1 in the arm. And one of them had to have his thigh bone cut open by some sharp instrument in order to take out the deeply buried bullet. But these are just daily life in Canton, a lot of such examples. What was even more revealing was that these extracted bullets were publicly exhibited in the hospital, together with extracted bladder and kidney stones, tumors, dead bones, and other body parts that form a kind of museum of biomedical curios to allure local Cantonese to try exotic Western surgical art. So clearly, 19th century Cantonese, like our protagonist, the Bengali Neil, who sought help in a Buddhist monastery, were not afraid to try unfamiliar or exotic methods to treat their illnesses and injuries. And this attitude, I think, was clearly an integral part of the cosmopolitan culture and spirit of adventure so vividly depicted in Mr. Ghosh's successful novels, which are much better than history books that I write. Thank you very much.
Our last panelist is Tan Sen. I'm not sure what you're going to say, but he can say anything. It will be interesting.
I'm going to talk about China's India connection. I do connections between India and China, looking at the early phases. Just now Angela was mentioning about Buddhism and how Buddhist monastic institutions served as clinics, basically. And that was not a new phenomena. And I worked on the Buddhist connections between India and China in my first book. I've been doing 2 things since then. One is on working on Chenhe and his connections to India. And the third project that I'm working on is on the Chinese community in Calcutta. And the last one has directly relevance to what Amitav has written. In fact, when the third book came out, and I had the privilege to get an advanced copy from Amitav, I argued that the trilogy actually serves as an important contribution to study the connections between India and China, especially for the period that is neglected. Usually when you look at the history of India-China connections, it ends with Chenhe, 15th century, and everything after that is a black hole until Tagore comes to China in 1924. And clearly, as Amitav's book, trilogy points out, a lot is happening during the colonial phase of India-China connections. In fact, it's not just opium, it's also cotton, it's also tea, it's also porcelain, it's also the movement of people back and forth, not only soldiers, but carpenters, dentists. They are moving, revolutionaries, that they are moving back and forth between India and China. I'll just say a few things about, first, to highlight the importance of Canton. Especially for the early phase, Canton was a very important place where Buddhist monks came to in the 3rd century, 4th century, and they established some of the earliest monastic institutions in Canton. In fact, I would argue that it's the establishment of Buddhist monastic institutions in Canton that eventually facilitated the transmission of Buddhism to Southeast Asia. We don't find evidence of Buddhism in Southeast Asia before the 5th century. And it seems to be the connections between coastal India and Canton that essentially created a mechanism through which monks then started halting in Southeast Asia, Sumatra, Java, that finally in the 5th century we find the early evidence of Buddhism, some coming not from India but from China. And there's evidence of Indian monks who first arrived in Canton and then going to Southeast Asia. And so I think Canton plays an important role. And already in the 3rd to 5th century, I think these monastic institutions in Canton are playing an important role for the seafarers, the traders who are coming to Canton. They are at that time already serving as clinics for the merchants, foreign merchant communities, not only Indian but others as well. So the role of Canton is not something new, not from the 18th century, but goes back, I would argue, 4th century CE. The other aspect that we see, and this is brought about again in Amitav's work, the connections are not just between Indians and Chinese. I think from early on, the India-China connection itself is very cosmopolitan. There are Sogdians, Iranians, there are Sri Lankans, who don't call them Indians, for some reason they are categorized as one. But there are other people who are part of these connections from very early on. So it's not only Canton which is cosmopolitan, but the connections between India and China are also very, very cosmopolitan. The third aspect that I find very important in Amitav's work is, and something that historians really don't know about, is what actually happened on the boats. There's very little evidence, even during the Champa voyages, about when the 200 ships are sailing, what's taking place on the boats. Again, those boats are examples of cosmopolitan also. There are people from different parts of Asia, Africa, interpreters, captives, rulers, who are on these boats. What's happening on the boats? And so when you read Amitav's these trilogy, you see the different kinds of people on these boats as they travel across the Bay of Bengal. And that leads us to imagination, and Amitav is correct saying that the lack of sources is problematic. But then I think we have to look at some of the imaginations. We do have an earlier source when the Chinese monk Faxian, for example, traveled from Sri Lanka into Southeast Asia and to China. He talks about his experience on the boat, about how it was affected by cyclone, how he was almost overthrown, thrown out of the boat by non-Buddhists, what kind of conversation he had, what kind of things he had with him. We have those kinds of things, but perhaps not from the later periods, even for the Champa period. But that requires us historians to actually think of what may have taken place when people speaking different languages came together on a floating thing, which was halting at different places. So I think Amitav's theology also forces us historians to look at the spaces which are not fixed, and what happened when people moved from one place to another. The other issue that connects to my research on the Chinese community in India, Calcutta in particular, are this fascinating movement of people taking place through Southeast Asia. So Helen mentioned about the inter-Asian connections, and this is something we, following Helen's example, are also trying to do at NYU Shanghai, is to look at Asia not from regional perspective, but trans-regional connected perspectives. And it becomes very clear that those kinds of connections are very important because the period that Amitav is writing, the 18th, 19th century, the connections is not only just India and China, but Penang, Singapore, London, because one of the sources that's quite important for this period is the letters that Jamsetji Jijiboi wrote to various people, and he's not only concerned about the price of opium, but also the price of cotton. But then how he gets paid is through London, and so he's writing to London as well. What's happening to my money, and when I'm getting that back? So that kind of connectivity that exists in the 18th, 19th century is quite important, and we see this within the Chinese community in Calcutta as they move from near Canton, actually, a place called Supai. This is the Cantonese who were famous for their carpentry work. They moved to Malaysia first, and from Malaysia they go to Calcutta, and they bring with them temples. These are Chinese temples that went from Supai to places near Penang, Ipoh, and then Kuala Lumpur, and then to Kolkata. And what temples are these? These are temples for two Chinese Buddhas. These are Chinese historical figures who in the 12th century became Buddhas. Of course, the Indian Buddha would not recognize them, but they moved, and these temples exist in Malaysia, and this exists in Calcutta. And you see the commodities that is moving among this temple network. All the architecture, all the things inside are coming from Canton, going to Malaysia, and then going to Calcutta. So this opium connection has important implications to other exchanges. And I think that's what is very important to consider as far as looking at this intra-Asian connections are concerned. And even Amitav's trilogy is not only just India, China, Singapore appears as a major player in opium trading activities. But also, the last thing about who are moving. These are not elite people who are moving. And usually when we focus on Tagore, we think about the intellectual connections between India and China. But the connection among the laborers, workers trying to find job in Calcutta, working for British shipyard or tea gardens in Darjeeling or Assam, these people are workers trying to find profit. And they have not left behind many records, but still they exist. Their descendants are still there in India. And it is very important to study what we call perhaps the subalterns who move between India and China. And again, this is where Amitav's trilogy matters, because he is talking about those kinds of people who have not left behind any histories, but still are important connectivity factors. And the last thing is the sources. I think Amitav pointed that out, but I would say there are two very important sources that would help us understand what Amitav said earlier. One is this Jamsetji Jijiboi's writings, and here you see his concerns about how he's dealing with commodity prices changing, cotton being supplied from England, and how that affects his business. The price mechanism in opium, how that affects his business. And so his writings, again, are important sources for understanding the dealings of the Parsi traders during the period that Amitav has written. The other book that he mentions is by Gadadhar Singh. This is an Indian soldier who came to fight the Boxer War, and he writes a book called 13 Months in China. And that's something I think Helen's, this edited volume has a chapter by Anand Yang. The book has been translated from Hindi to English and will appear later this year, but that is an important source, as Amitav was pointing out, from the perspective of an Indian soldier. And that, I think, deals with how you live a life under the colonial rule as a simple Indian soldier. He writes in 1902, the book is published in 1902 from Lucknow, but it deals with, I think, all the conditions of Indian soldiers, how they are taken and how they work in China. So there are sources that are coming to light, and I think what we need to do is to have those sources, but also be imaginative to write the history of this very important period of the 19th century. Thank you.
Sure. I have a question for Angela. Now, Angela, you've seen certainly those amazing pictures by Lamqua of the patients who went through Peter Parker's hospital in Guangzhou. So, what I'd like to ask you is, do you think those pictures were exaggerated? What does it tell you about the nature of disease in the 19th century? In what ways it differs from today?
I think it's, if you look at the hospital reports, you can see that actually those paintings by Lamqua, many of those developed from the sketches in the hospital reports. So I don't think they are exaggerations. I don't think they're exaggerations, but I think the point is that the Canton Hospital found a niche in Canton in specializing in surgeries, and Peter Parker and his successor John Kerr make a deliberate choice of doing surgeries, especially spectacular surgeries like cutting out huge tumors, cutting out legs, and all that, to show that Western surgical art is superior to Chinese surgical art. So I think there is a element of advertisement there. And Lamqua, well, some said that he's a disciple of Chinnery. We are not sure. But I think his nephew worked as a disciple for Peter Parker and John Kerr later. And I think he knew very well what the hospital is up to. So I think there is a lot of, I don't think it's exaggeration, but there is an element of advertisement there to demonstrate the effectiveness of Western surgical art and how far it could go. And yeah, that's what.
Well, again, I'd like to come back, to this question of, the emergence of the modern privately owned corporation, and what part of it do you think? In what ways would you say that today's Chinese corporations, family corporations, and certainly Parsi family corporations? I mean, even though, say, the Tata Corporation is now one of the world's largest, owns so much, is actually the largest employer in Britain. In what ways were these corporations? I mean, it's clear that the Tata Corporation is quite distinctive in the manner of its structuring. What do you think that owes to the 19th century?
Well, a lot of scholars have studied that, and many scholars have studied that, and they know a whole lot more about this issue than I do. I think the general conclusion is that there's a lot more adoption of the Western form to fit the cultural needs of the sort of the people. Now, I guess getting at it from the 19th century, what I see a lot more of is that we need to debunk a lot of the notions of corporation that we have from a presentist perspective and projecting it into the 19th century. That's something that we need to get rid of. Just to give you an example, I think a lot of times people will fault Chinese corporations for their ill-suited form to amass capital, because the families break apart and you have the annual cycle, you have to generate cash or whatnot. Some of the traders, the American traders who worked with Hopla, who got into your trilogy as well, they worked in partnerships of 1 to 3 years. And every 3 years, they will need to reconstitute the partnership. So that problem is actually as much of a perennial problem for these American traders as they were for the Chinese merchants. And the Chinese merchants, because the money actually got captured in the family, and much of the business was done in the idiom of the family and relations, that was actually more of a long-lasting legacy that a lot of these businesses developed so long as they were commercially viable. So I think I need to study more of the 20th century development. I tend to think of it more as an early 20th century phenomenon, and I think with the re-emergence of a lot of these companies outside of the Western domain, we are seeing the resurfacing of a lot more of these cultural forms in the definition of a corporation now that would remind us of what happened in the 19th century.
Okay, I'll ask you a more general question.
All right?
In the 18th century, early 19th century, what we see happening in Guangzhou is that, Chinese merchants, Indian merchants, Western merchants amass capital, they invest in speculative ventures, they issue shares. There's this whole structure there for enterprise. Now, so 2 questions there. Why do we not think of that as capitalism? Or why do we think of capitalism only in the late 19th century or mid 19th century? Secondly, isn't it very strange that now people talk about China, as it were, discovering capitalism, whereas what we see today in the PRC to me seems exactly like 18th century Chinese enterprise. Certain kinds of speculative ventures, completely under a very tight regulatory control.
I think I may disagree with you on the assessment that it was not capitalism. It is probably not capitalism.
No, I think it was capitalism.
Okay, so I disagree with the notion that it's not capitalism. I think that it's actually just as capitalistic as our current environment. The only reason that I think, business professors will think of it as less of a form of capitalism is because it's a lot more difficult to calibrate the flow of money and goods. Money is a big one, right? Now we study accounting. That's a functional currency. US dollar, sterling, what is it? The Chinese merchant I studied, well, I actually do not know if he was ever capable of putting a real estimate on his fortune. You have boatloads of tea floating to America, and you have bills on bankroll in your safe, and you have this type of silver, that type of silver, in addition to your tails, and everything that you keep in your accounting books. So it was a lot more dynamic, a lot more fluid, and I would submit for the consideration of the group that it was actually more difficult to do business then. It requires more of a mind that could hold all the information in one place. It's a lot easier now that you just pull up your bank statement and you know precisely what the final tally is. So I do agree with you that it was just as capitalistic. I'm sorry, I lost your second question.
It was about what do you see as, is there an essential difference between what was happening, the functioning of the economy in 18th century China and what we see in the PRC today?
I see a lot of parallels. So a lot of the 19th century merchants had the issue of trying to figure out what to sell to the other party, right? So is no coincidence that tea actually lubricated global flows in such a way that it became a predictable annual exchange, because tea is addictive. And you sell it to London, they drink it, and every year they demand a certain amount from you. And for a while it was quite problematic to figure out how to complete that transfer, right? So the East Indian Company shipped woolens over. Well, on a day like today, can you imagine getting a lot of woolens and just trying to sell in this part of the world? The Americans sold otter-skin fur. Again, not quite suitable for our climate. And ginseng, but then actually their ginseng is not what we thought of as ginseng. American ginseng, Korean and Manchurian ginseng, those are different. And the circle was not complete until we have silver. So I guess back to my answer to your original question, silver is not just a unit of account. It is a commodity in different forms in which they traded. And of course, opium helped complete that circle in a different way. So I see a lot of parallels in today's environment. The balance of trade issues We may have more of a functional currency extended unique accounts, but then to figure out what you can buy and sell to one another is a tricky business. Maybe less so now because of our global convergence of certain tastes, but just as tricky, especially when you're trying to cut across a lot of these international boundaries.
One last question. Did they have double entry bookkeeping?
I do not know if what the Chinese did was double entry bookkeeping. I don't feel that it is. I think, again, it's the convergence of our attention and interest into this one thing that seems to be the magic bullet to have kickstarted Western capitalism. What I find intriguing is just the way they enter data, and more importantly, when you're looking at early 19th century Canton, it's not just the numbers. I mean, of course, you record the numbers differently too, but the different languages that you need to, or the hurdles you need to overcome to even have a contract. So some of the contracts, some of the early 19th century contracts that I've seen, well, Westerners seem to be more adamant about that in certain forms. Chinese have their own records. The stamping system is totally different. But we think of the legality of these documents, I think, in a more rigid way than they did. So again, the Chinese merchant I studied, he would willingly sign with his brushstroke in English, his name Hopewell, in a document that he didn't understand. Why is he stupid? Well, I think it's risk management and how he stepped up his level of investment and involvement in the business over time. And you see actually funny notations in there that would show you that he really didn't know what that document was. There will be notations in there that says, this is the letter. I'm just greeting this person. Invoice paid in full. We think of it as criminal, right? You and I would never sign a document that we don't understand. But how powerful was a document? What was the possibility of him being held in a certain court with that document? I think that level of assessment, that level of risk management is something that I'm only beginning to comprehend. And I think there's a totally different set of calculations for those people than it is for us today.
Could I barge in here with a more cultural question, that I think addresses this? As an anthropologist, I've been walking around Saiwan area, and I came across old coin shops. And I've been looking for the medium of exchange during 18th, 19th century, these silver coins, trade dollars, right? The yin yang and all those. So in a sense, silver was basically mined in the New World, in Mexico, before and after independence. And then they were minted in very different areas, in India, in South Africa, in probably China, Hong Kong, whatever. I'm not a financial historian, but I've found, I've been asking for these coins, these silver coins, not as a collector's item, but as a cultural artifact, because many of them are as ugly as you can think of, and the shopkeeper would just very readily, just give them to me for very cheap prices, because they said no collector would want those. But in fact, I was looking for those signs. They were stamped and mutilated, very mutilated, by the stamp of particular native bankers to prove or to how would I say, to confirm that that silver coin has the particular percentage of silver content, that they are not faked. And so here you see a very, very important medium of exchange. You have taels of silver, whatever, but these silver coins were the one of the most important medium of exchange by multinational, multicultural traders. And why would they believe that that coin is real? Right? And so I just thought that what are the cultural mechanisms for monitoring, for to the point that each merchant house could actually manage their risk. But it really talks about a shared system of trust, isn't it? So I just thought that culturally, how do you deal with that?
You're asking me? No, I think.
For the early part, just talking about how monetary this coins worked in different cultural settings. The Romans, when they were taking out some coins from circulation, would cut the coins. But it didn't circulate in the Roman Empire, but it would make sense to use them in India. So in India, it was still being used as a currency, while in Roman, so we find these cut coins in Archimedu or other southern regions. Same with the Chinese copper coins. I mean, when it was exported, they were not exported as currency, but as copper. And then they were melted and used to make copper objects. So it changed. I mean, so the silver coins may also have that kind of usage beyond just the monetary use as well in different places. And maybe
how would they believe that that box of silver coins had that value? That's what I couldn't figure out.
Well, you've heard the name Shroff. That's what Shroffs did. They just sat around counting coins, weighing them, judging, how much silver content they had or copper content. Basically, they were money changers, and that was a huge profession. Now we don't really have them as when we have ATMs, but that's what they were doing.
Shall we open up for questions of people? Just feel free to raise your hands and then we'll pass you the mic. We have about 10 minutes.
Well, first of all, thank you all very much. But would you like to speculate more on why opium isn't better understood and studied? Because on the one hand, it's part of almost a trope of Chinese history, the unequal treaties, the opium wars, et cetera, and yet I'm doing work on Hong Kong right now. I've been struck by exactly the same thing. I mean, Hong Kong finances were funded by property and opium until after World War II. And this is almost never talked about. So what's going on?
It's not just Hong Kong, Singapore also. I mean, the reason that they could be free ports as such was because the British gave out the opium monopoly. They had this opium farm which they handed out. Actually, the Singapore and Hong Kong and the finances have been studied. Carl Trocchi is the sort of great expert on it, and he's written at great length about that. But certainly, I mean, you're right. It's not something that people address. In the Indian case, it's much stranger because really the opium trade until the 1920s was really the financial underpinning of the British Raj, And during the first opium wars, so many British merchants, when they were appealing to Lord Palmerston to intervene and start the war, what they basically said is that, without opium you won't have an empire. And actually, the British Empire didn't long outlast, the banning of opium, which happened actually in the 20s. So really, so much of their revenue came from opium. But why is it not studied? I don't know. Amar Farooqi was one of the Indian historians who's written at length on opium. He was actually in college with me. So I asked him once, I said, why do you think that this happens? Why don't people write about it? He said he tried to get many of his students interested, but they simply didn't want to touch it. There's a kind of stigma or an unwillingness to deal with the subject or something like that. It must be that, because there's some sort of resistance to acknowledging the degree to which opium was really the foundation of the modern economy. I mean, if you consider that really, Amar Farooqi has written a book called Bombay Opium City, where he shows that essentially, if not for the starting of the opium trade, Bombay would have been abandoned in the 18th century. So if you think that it was the opium trade that really sustained Mumbai, Singapore, Hong Kong, and basically the French used the same model in Indochina, the Dutch in the East Indies. So, it's, I suppose, the story that nobody wants to acknowledge.
Maybe I can just shout. Thanks very much for the panel's discussion. There's been a lot of talk about cultural interchange, cosmopolitanism, mixing, but how much of the story was in fact not mixing? I mean, when I think of where many of these different communities came together, say in Burma, often the Indians took different sectors of the economy, they lived in different parts of the country. They didn't actually mix that much. They often went home, in fact, for some part of the year, and then came back to do some more trade or some more business or some more agricultural labor. And we find today that there's a situation where they're not seen as part of that society, particularly up in Rakhine State, which you visited just a few months ago. So, yeah, to what extent are we talking about not mixing as a fundamental strand of this story?
That's a very interesting question. I think whenever you're dealing with pre-modern merchant communities, it's actually one of the most interesting aspects of this, you know. If you look at the Armenians, Baghdadi Jews, Parsis, Indian Jains, Sindhis, and all these communities which, which became sort of very, very successful merchant communities. There's a very tight emphasis on endogamy, on staying, keeping yourself separate. Because I suppose, for one thing, it's about trust. So much of their dealings were based on trust. So, the merchant that I wrote about, the North African merchant who went to live in India in the early, in the 12th century. Again, he married an Indian woman, had children with her, but at the end, he abandons her, he takes his children, leaves, goes back to the Middle East, and at that point, his whole life is about trying to re-establish his bonds with the Jewish community that he originally came from. So I think there are two things here. One is that, there are several things. We do know that the Parsis who came to Guangzhou and then to Hong Kong, they did take Chinese wives and mistresses, inevitably, because, they were away from home for sometimes years. And they did have children with them, and actually they did employ these children in their own companies. Wu Lian has written about this at some length. There was, in people's lives, there were multiple facets in these merchants' lives, I think. There was one facet in which they're interacting with other communities in the most intimate ways. But there is another aspect where they're establishing membership within their own communities, So it's a very complex kind of interchange that happens there. We see this also with, say, the Shia merchants, who travel, who actually invent a form of marriage called mut'a marriage, whereby they could take temporary wives. Actually, this is now being reinterpreted by ISIS. But it's a long tradition. But I think what is actually really interesting is, I've been talking about the very rich and successful communities. But when you look at actually working class communities, that is to say soldiers, Lascars, and so on, they do completely merge into local communities. There were large numbers of Indian prisoners, for example, who were sent to Australia in the late 18th century. Where are they now? We know that they're not separate. They just melted into the community. Large numbers of Lascars lived in London in the 19th century. They just vanished into the communities. We've seen again that this guy Vivek Bald has written a very interesting book about Bangladeshi or Bengali sailors who jumped ship in America in the 20th century. They all merged into African American communities, And in fact, there's this very curious sort of interchange. I mean that, at a certain point, African Americans would start mimicking Indian forms of being in order to, as it were, establish a separate presence. It's a very, very interesting set of interchanges that you see there. I'm absolutely convinced that you have the same thing happening here. I've written a lot in these books about children of mixed marriages and mixed unions, and everybody knows that in Guangzhou there was a very large community of mixed race children, and at some points, they just melted into the wider society. One of the really exciting things about writing these books is that I get letters now. From families, especially in Hong Kong, saying, this is what you've written about is really an aspect of my life. My great-great-great-grandfather was an Indian trader who married a Chinese person, and we are now trying to unravel our genealogies. So that's one thing. The other point that I really want to make is that, you know, the late 18th and early 19th century, what is so interesting about Guangzhou is that it's a cosmopolitanism which is not a European cosmopolitanism. You know, it's not a colonial cosmopolitanism. So what happens there is actually completely different from what we later come to think of as these colonial cities. So in Guangzhou, you know, what is so interesting is that it's the one place on earth at that time where already Europe is hegemonic and so powerful. It's the one place on earth where, you know, Indians, Asians, Westerners are meeting more or less as equals, you know, under the aegis of an Asian power. Once Guangzhou is destroyed, once the foreign enclave in Guangzhou is destroyed in 1856, after that, when you see the way that Shamian Island is built, it's completely a colonial settlement, you know, with intense racial segregation. So when the British found Singapore, already there's this intense, what they put in place is these very elaborate forms of racial segregation, you know, so parts of the city are marked off for Indians, for Malays, etc. This is completely different from Malacca. You know, in Malacca there wasn't this. There were Indians. You know, when the Portuguese arrived in Malacca, there were 4,000 Gujaratis living in Malacca. So, I think what you're talking about is actually interesting. This separateness is actually, to some very great degree, you know, a manifestation of a certain kind of racialized colonialism.
If I may add, one of the separation that takes place in Calcutta is not only between the Chinese and the locals, but also between the Hakkas and the Cantonese in Calcutta. So the Hakkas in Calcutta separate themselves not only from the local Bengalis, but also the Cantonese community, and create their own gated community, and they marry within. And that has existed even now. They have moved on to Toronto, but they still come back to Calcutta and marry the local Hakka and not others.
One last question before we go. No? In that case, maybe I just want to thank the speakers and the panelists, and I hope that feel free to come down here to have a chat with any of us before you leave. And thank you very much for coming. And thank you, Amitav.